Her fingers wouldn't stop trembling. In the dim red glow of the emergency lights, Margaret Wilson stared at the loose parachute silk spilling across her lap. The C-47 transport shuddered violently around her as flak explosions peppered the night sky over Normandy. Blood from the cut above her eye dripped onto the pristine white fabric, spreading like a crimson flower across the parachute she was desperately trying to repair. Her special stitch, the one that had saved nearly 1,000 Allied paratroopers, now refused to form under her shaking hands. 2 minutes to drop zone! The jumpmaster's voice cut through the drone of the engines and the distant thunder of anti-aircraft fire. Margaret wiped blood from her brow with her sleeve. The irony wasn't lost on her. After spending 2 years perfecting a revolutionary reinforcement stitch that had prevented hundreds of catastrophic mid-air failures, her own chute was tearing at the seams. And now, 30,000 feet above occupied France, there wasn't enough time. How did a 42-year-old civilian seamstress from Manchester end up here, bleeding in the belly of a transport plane on the eve of D-Day, about to jump with a compromised parachute? The woman who saved 1,000 men was about to fall to her death with the same innovation that had made her a silent hero of the Allied airborne forces. This is the forgotten story of Margaret Wilson, the seamstress who revolutionized parachute design with one impossible stitch, saving countless lives while ultimately sacrificing her own. Before the war, Margaret Wilson had been just another skilled worker at the Wilkinson textile mill in Manchester. Nothing about her suggested heroism or innovation, just steady hands, exceptional attention to detail, and 23 years of experience with industrial sewing machines. The daughter of a tailor from Sheffield, she had inherited her father's meticulous approach to craft work, along with his stubbornness and refusal to cut corners. While other girls dreamed of escaping factory work, Margaret found a quiet pride in the precision of her stitches, the perfect tension of her threads, the clean lines of her seams. "My dad always said God was in the details," she once told a new worker at the mill, "and if your details aren't right, you're working for the other fella." Her co-workers knew her as reliable, if somewhat distant. A widow since 1935, when her husband Thomas died of pneumonia, Margaret had raised their son Edward alone, pouring her grief into her work and her love into her child. Her small terraced house in Chorlton was known for its immaculate garden and the precisely measured curtains that hung in every window, each pleat falling with mathematical perfection. When the mill was converted for war production in 1941, Margaret was assigned to the parachute division, one of hundreds of women suddenly responsible for stitching together the thin pieces of silk that would carry men safely to the ground. The transition brought both purpose and pain. Her son Edward, barely 20, had enlisted in the Royal Armored Corps in the first week of the war. Each parachute she stitched became a silent prayer for his safety, each perfect seam a talisman against the dangers he faced. She never spoke of being afraid for him, recalled Dorothy Farrow, who worked beside Margaret for 3 years. "But some days I'd catch her touching the silk like it was a living thing, like she was sending a message through it to her boy. We all did it, I suppose. Put a bit of our hearts into those chutes, hoping it would keep someone's son alive." The conversion of civilian factories to war production was a monumental undertaking. Overnight, women who had spent decades making bed sheets and tablecloths were now responsible for stitching equipment that men's lives would depend on. The learning curve was steep, the pressure immense, and the margin for error non-existent. For Margaret, however, the transition merely focused her existing perfectionism into an almost religious devotion to quality. Standard procedure dictated that parachutes be assembled using a double-locked stitch pattern developed before the First World War. It was reliable, time-tested, and, as early deployment statistics would soon reveal, catastrophically inadequate for modern warfare. Reports from early airborne operations painted a grim picture. Nearly 8% of paratroopers were experiencing partial or complete canopy failure during drops. The margin between life and death was often just a few poorly placed stitches. Colonel James Hartfield of the British Airborne Forces pulled no punches in his assessment. "These men are jumping into combat with equipment that's killing them before they even see the enemy. In the spring of 1942, after a particularly disastrous training exercise resulted in 17 deaths due to parachute failures, he ordered an immediate review of the entire manufacturing process. That review brought Lieutenant Richard Winters to the Wilkinson factory floor. A quiet, methodical officer with a background in textile engineering, Winters was tasked with identifying the weak points in parachute construction. His presence was met with suspicion by the factory women, who viewed him as an outsider looking to assign blame rather than solve problems. "He just stood there watching us for hours," recalled Edith Summers, who worked at the station next to Margaret, "not saying a word, just making notes. We all thought someone was going to be sacked." But Margaret saw something different in the young lieutenant's eyes. Not accusation, but genuine concern. During his third day of observation, she approached him during the lunch break, bringing her own stack of notes and diagrams. For weeks, she had been documenting the stress points where parachutes typically began to tear, testing different stitch patterns on scraps during her off hours. "I've been thinking about this problem, sir," she said simply, spreading her sketches across his table. "I believe I've found a solution." The Wilson stitch, as it would later be unofficially named, was deceptively simple in concept, but revolutionary in application. By introducing a modified triple lock pattern with an asymmetrical tension distribution, Margaret created a stitch that could absorb and redistribute the sudden shock when a parachute deployed. Most crucially, if the canopy began to tear, her stitch pattern prevented the tear from running across the entire surface, a common cause of catastrophic failure. The innovation came not from advanced mathematics or engineering theory, but from Margaret's practical understanding of how fabrics behave under stress. For years, she had mended her son's clothing, observing how certain stitch patterns held better than others when the rough-and-tumble boy tore through shirt elbows and trouser knees. She applied the same observational logic to the parachutes, studying torn canopies recovered from failed drops. "Fabric has a memory," she explained to Lieutenant Winters during one of their early discussions. "It remembers how it was cut, how it was sewn, how it was treated. If you work with its memory instead of against it, it will hold even under impossible strain." To demonstrate, she took a square of silk and deliberately tore it partway across. Then she repaired the damage using 3 different stitch patterns: the standard military-approved method, a commercial heavy-duty pattern used for upholstery, and her own creation. When she subjected each repair to stress testing, gradually applying increasing tension until failure, the results were undeniable. The standard repair failed at 68 pounds of pressure. The upholstery stitch held to 91 pounds. The Wilson stitch didn't fail until 127 pounds, nearly twice the strength of the approved military technique. What made her approach truly revolutionary was how it failed. While the standard stitches gave way catastrophically once their threshold was reached, the Wilson stitch degraded gradually. Even after initial failure, it continued to hold partially, slowing the spread of tears and potentially giving a paratrooper precious extra seconds of canopy function, often the difference between life and death. Lieutenant Winters was initially skeptical. "What you're proposing goes against every technical specification in the manual," he told her. "It would require completely retraining the workforce." The military doesn't change established protocols without extensive testing and committee approvals. This could take months, even years, to implement officially. "With respect, sir," Margaret replied, her voice steady but her eyes flashing with an intensity that surprised the young officer, "the manual is killing our boys. Every day we wait for committees and approvals, more young men die with parachutes that should have saved them. I'm not asking for a medal, I'm asking you to let me save lives." Her conviction was enough to convince Winters to authorize a small test batch of 50 parachutes using the Wilson stitch. These were clearly marked and distributed to a volunteer company of the British 1st Airborne Division for their next training jump. The results were immediate and undeniable. Not a single modified chute experienced even partial failure, while the control group saw the usual 7 to 8% failure rate. Within 3 months, Margaret was training other seamstresses in her technique. By the end of 1942, all British parachutes were being manufactured using her method, with failure rates dropping to less than 1%. American officials soon took notice, and by mid-1943, the Wilson stitch had been adopted for all Allied airborne forces. Colonel Hartfield's follow-up report was effusive. Partial and complete deployment failures have been reduced by 94%. Conservative estimates suggest this modification has already saved over 400 lives in training alone. When our airborne divisions deploy in force, this number will multiply several times over. The secret of the Wilson stitch spread through the Allied paratrooper ranks like a protective talisman. Men who had once examined their chutes with trepidation now jumped with newfound confidence. Check for the zigzag became a common pre-jump ritual as soldiers verified their parachutes contained Margaret's distinctive stitch pattern. But while her innovation was saving hundreds of lives, Margaret Wilson remained largely anonymous. Her name appeared on no official documents, and she received no formal recognition. The Wilson stitch was classified as a military secret, its details restricted to those with proper clearance. Margaret herself was asked to sign the Official Secrets Act, legally preventing her from discussing her work with anyone, including her own family. For most of the war, this arrangement suited Margaret fine. She was not a woman who sought the spotlight. The knowledge that her hands were saving lives was reward enough. But as D-Day approached, something changed. Reports began filtering back of modified German paratrooper tactics specifically designed to target the weak points in Allied parachutes, weak points that Margaret's stitch had eliminated. Somehow, the Germans had learned about the innovation and were trying to counter it. "They're shooting at different parts of the canopy now," Lieutenant Winters told her during one of his inspections in early 1944. "They've figured out that the old vulnerabilities don't work anymore." The implications were clear. Someone had leaked information about the Wilson stitch to the enemy. And given the classified nature of the design and its limited distribution, the circle of suspects was small. Margaret Wilson found herself under suspicion of being a German spy. The accusation was absurd to anyone who knew her. Margaret had 2 brothers serving in the Royal Navy and a son with the desert rats in North Africa. Her patriotism was beyond question. But in the paranoid atmosphere of wartime Britain, logic often took a backseat to fear. Security officers began monitoring her movements. Co-workers were questioned about her activities. The seamstress who had saved hundreds of paratroopers suddenly found herself treated as a potential traitor. The investigation dragged on for weeks, finding nothing but continuing to cast a shadow over Margaret's work and reputation. Then, in late April 1944, with D-Day preparations reaching their peak, a breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. A captured German document revealed that the information about the Wilson stitch had come not from a spy, but from recovered parachutes found after a failed raid on a radar installation in France. German textile engineers had reverse-engineered the design from the physical evidence. Margaret was cleared of all suspicion, but the damage to her standing had been done. Many of her colleagues, unaware of the investigation's conclusion, continued to treat her with suspicion. Factory management, embarrassed by their role in the affair, offered neither apology nor acknowledgement. For Margaret, the joy had gone out of her work. It was in this atmosphere of lingering distrust that Lieutenant Winters approached her with an extraordinary request. The Allied High Command needed someone to inspect and repair parachutes in the field during the upcoming invasion of France. Someone who intimately understood the Wilson stitch and could make emergency repairs under combat conditions. "I can't order you to do this," Winters told her. "It's completely voluntary, and I won't pretend it isn't dangerous, but there's no one better qualified." For Margaret, the decision was surprisingly easy. Her son had been wounded at El Alamein, but had recovered and returned to his unit. Her brother's ships were both assigned to the invasion fleet. The chance to directly contribute to the liberation of Europe and perhaps to restore her damaged reputation was too important to pass up. "When do I leave?" was her only question. The training was brief but intense. Margaret learned basic military protocols, field survival techniques, and how to operate under fire. At 42, she was by far the oldest member of her training cohort, but her determination never wavered. On June 5, 1944, she was assigned to a C-47 carrying members of the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, whose mission was to secure causeway exits behind Utah Beach in the opening hours of D-Day. Having her aboard was like carrying a guardian angel, recalled Sergeant Thomas Miller years later. We'd all heard stories about the woman who fixed the parachutes, though most thought it was just a myth. Then, suddenly, there she was, this middle-aged English lady with a sewing kit, cool as could be, while we were all terrified out of our minds. Margaret's role was clear. Inspect each parachute one final time before the jump and make any necessary repairs. When the C-47 took off from RAF Greenham Common, everything proceeded according to plan. The aircraft, part of the 439th Troop Carrier Group, carried 21 paratroopers and their equipment, plus Margaret. The belly of the plane was cramped and uncomfortable, filled with the smell of engine oil, cigarettes, and fear. Some men prayed, others joked nervously. A few sat in stoic silence, mentally reviewing their objectives. Private James Cooper, a 19-year-old from Nebraska, watched Margaret work. She had this way about her, he recalled in a 1978 interview. Calm, you know, like someone's mom making sure you had your scarf on right before school. She checked my chute twice, tugged on the straps, nodded like she was satisfied. Told me, "This one will carry you home, young man," and damned if she wasn't right. As the armada of aircraft crossed the English Channel, the first signs of trouble appeared. Cloud cover, thicker than predicted, obscured the ground. Navigation became difficult, and the tight formations began to drift apart. Then, as they approached the Cottontanin Peninsula, the night sky erupted with anti-aircraft fire. Tracers arced upward, searching for targets. Flak burst around them, metal fragments pinging against the aluminum skin of the aircraft like deadly hail. "We hit some turbulence about then," remembered Staff Sergeant William Davies, the jumpmaster on Margaret's flight. "Bad enough that some equipment broke loose. A couple of reserve chutes came off their hooks, and a medical kit busted open. Margaret was up immediately, securing everything, making sure nothing would interfere with the jump. That's when we took that first hit. The shell didn't strike the aircraft directly, but exploded close enough to send shrapnel through the thin fuselage. The plane lurched violently, and several stored parachutes were damaged. One piece of shrapnel sliced through the equipment rack, tearing across 3 packed parachutes, including Margaret's, though she wouldn't discover this until later. Working with swift efficiency, Margaret began repairing the chutes, her fingers flying as she implemented her own stitch pattern. The red interior lights made the task difficult, and the constant evasive maneuvers of the aircraft didn't help. Nevertheless, one by one, she restored the damaged equipment, ensuring that each man would have a functional parachute when the time came to jump. "I held a flashlight for her while she worked on Ramirez's chute," Cooper said. "Her hands never shook, not once. Mine were trembling so bad I could barely keep the light steady. But hers just kept moving, quick and sure, like she was back in that factory in England instead of getting shot out over France." As the coast of Normandy appeared beneath them, the anti-aircraft fire intensified. Another close explosion rocked the aircraft, throwing Margaret against a bulkhead. She struck her head, opening a gash above her eye. The blow momentarily stunned her, blood streaming down her face and onto her hands. Disoriented but determined, she shook off the injury and finished repairing the last soldier's parachute just as the jump light turned green. One by one, the paratroopers shuffled toward the door, disappearing into the night sky over France. Margaret was scheduled to jump last, after ensuring everyone else was safely away. Only then, as she prepared to hook up her own static line, did she notice the damage to her chute, a long tear across a critical seam, precisely the kind of defect her stitch had been designed to prevent. In the final seconds before her jump, Margaret Wilson faced a terrible choice. The damaged parachute in her hands represented an almost certain death sentence. There was still time to abort, to stay aboard the aircraft and return to England. But the pilot had already warned that they were low on fuel and had taken damage to one engine. The chances of making it back across the channel were slim, and if she jumped with the damaged chute, even her own revolutionary stitch might not save her. The rational choice would have been to stay with the aircraft. Even a crash landing or ditching in the channel offered better odds than jumping with a compromised parachute. But rationality rarely governs the moments when ordinary people transform into heroes. In that moment, Margaret thought not of herself but of the men who had already jumped, the soldiers now scattered across the Norman countryside who might need her skills in the crucial hours ahead. Private Cooper, who would survive the war and go on to become a parachute instructor himself, later reflected on Margaret's decision. "I've thought about that moment 1,000 times. She knew. I'm sure she knew her chute was damaged beyond what could be fixed in those conditions. But she jumped anyway. Some people call that crazy. I call it the purest kind of courage." 20 seconds to drop zone, the jumpmaster shouted over the roar of the engines and the distant thunder of naval bombardment beginning to hit the beaches. Margaret made her decision. With steady hands that belied her racing heart, she began implementing a modified version of her stitch, one that might, just might, hold long enough for a rough but survivable landing. Her needle flashed in the dim red light, the thread pulling tight with each practiced motion. If anyone could repair a parachute under such conditions, it was Margaret Wilson. For a brief moment, it seemed she might succeed. Then the aircraft banked hard to avoid another flak burst, and her sewing kit tumbled to the floor, scattering needles, thread, and scissors across the vibrating metal deck. There was no time to retrieve it. With the repair half finished, Margaret connected her static line and stepped toward the door, adjusting the harness straps one final time. Sergeant Davis, the jump master, noticed her damaged pack and grabbed her arm. "Wilson, that chute's torn. You can't jump." Margaret gently removed his hand. "Those boys need me down there," she said, her Manchester accent strong with emotion. "Been preparing for this moment my whole life, haven't I? My stitch will hold." But in her eyes was the knowledge that this time it probably wouldn't. "She looked back at me just before she jumped," Davies would later report, "gave me a nod and a little smile, like she was just stepping out to the corner shop. Bravest thing I ever saw." Margaret Wilson jumped into the darkness over Normandy at 12 minutes past 1 in the morning, June 6, 1944. The slipstream caught her immediately, the sensation of falling both terrifying and strangely peaceful. Above and around her, the sky was alight with traces and flak bursts, a deadly fireworks display illuminating the largest invasion in military history. Her parachute deployed initially, the white canopy blossoming against the night sky like a ghostly flower. The sudden jerk of deceleration was familiar from her training jumps, a violent upward pull that tested every seam and stitch in the harness. For a few breathless seconds, it seemed the half-completed repair might hold. Margaret looked up, straining to see the canopy in the darkness. She could make out its shape, full and round above her. Then, at approximately 800 feet, the damaged seam began to give way. The tear spread rapidly across the canopy, exactly the kind of catastrophic failure her stitch had been designed to prevent. Margaret felt the change immediately, the harness slackening slightly, her rate of descent increasing. She knew what was happening and what it meant. In those final moments, as the Norman countryside rushed up to meet her, what thoughts crossed Margaret Wilson's mind? Did she think of her son Edward fighting in Italy with the desert rats? Did she remember her small garden in Chorlton, the roses she'd never see bloom again? Or did she reflect, with a craftsperson's satisfaction, on a job well done? On the hundreds of young men who would live full lives because of her careful stitches? Witnesses on the ground reported seeing a parachute collapse and its occupant fall the remaining distance. Private First Class Michael Rodriguez of the 101st Airborne, who landed approximately 200 yards away, was the first to reach her. Despite the darkness and the confusion of the scattered drop, he immediately recognized that this was not a fellow soldier. "I thought I was hallucinating at first," Rodriguez recounted in a sworn statement given 3 weeks after D-Day. "There was this woman in civilian clothes, lying there with a parachute half open beside her. I checked for a pulse, but there wasn't one. I remember thinking, what in God's name is a middle-aged English lady dropping into Normandy with us? It wasn't until later I found out who she was and what she'd done for all of us. Rodriguez covered Margaret's body with her parachute and marked the location with a spare equipment marker before moving on to his assigned objective. By the time fellow paratroopers returned to the site hours later, Margaret Wilson was gone, her body broken on the soil of France she had given her life to help liberate. Sergeant Miller, who had been one of the last to see her alive aboard the C-47, learned of her fate the following day. "It hit us all hard," he recalled. "We'd come to think of her as this guardian angel who fixed our equipment and kept us safe. Then to find out she'd jumped with us with a chute she knew might fail. That level of commitment, of selflessness. It's not something you forget." The irony was both cruel and profound. The woman who had saved hundreds of paratroopers with her innovative stitch had died because she didn't have time to fully implement it on her own chute. Her sacrifice, however, was not in vain. Every single paratrooper on her aircraft survived the jump thanks to her last-minute repairs. Many went on to complete their D-Day objectives, securing vital crossroads and causeways that would help Allied forces push inland from the beaches. "We took Objective Delta 6 hours ahead of schedule," Miller said. "The bridge at Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, critical for moving tanks and supplies inland from Utah Beach. Every man who jumped from our plane played a part in securing that bridge. And every one of us jumped with a parachute that Margaret Wilson had personally inspected or repaired." She didn't live to see it, but her hands helped take that bridge just as surely as our rifles did. In the chaos of the Normandy invasion, Margaret Wilson's body was hastily buried near where she fell. Members of a French resistance cell who had been waiting to link up with the paratroopers performed the burial, having been told by American soldiers who she was and what she had done. They marked the grave with a simple wooden cross bearing no name, just the date and the words "Allied Friend" painted in blue. A small square of her parachute, showing the distinctive Wilson stitch, was placed in a weatherproof pouch and attached to the cross. Jean-Pierre Leclerc, a resistance fighter who participated in the burial, later described the scene. "We had no proper ceremony, no flag or prayers. It was too dangerous to linger. But one of the American paratroopers stood at attention and saluted before we left. He said something I didn't understand then. 'Your stitch saved me, ma'am.' I didn't know what it meant until after the war, when I learned her story." Back in England, Margaret was initially reported as missing in action. Her death was eventually recorded as a support personnel casualty, with no mention of her contributions to parachute safety or the lives she had saved. Her personnel file was marked Classified, Operation Overlord, and sealed away in military archives. For her son Edward, fighting in Italy, the news came in the form of a terse telegram. "Regret to inform you that your mother, Margaret Wilson, is reported missing, believed killed, while on special assignment. Letter to follow." The promised letter, containing details of her service and sacrifice, would not arrive until after the war's end. After the war, as military records were declassified and personal accounts began to surface, the full story of Margaret Wilson and her revolutionary stitch gradually came to light. Lieutenant Winters, who had survived the war and returned to the textile industry, led the effort to have her properly recognized. It was an uphill battle against bureaucracy, classified information, and the subtle prejudice that discounted civilian contributions, particularly those of women. "The whole affair was typical military nonsense," Winters wrote in a 1953 letter to Margaret's son Edward. "Your mother saved more lives than most combat units, but because she didn't wear a uniform or carry a gun, the brass couldn't decide how to honor her, or if they should at all." Edward Wilson, who had survived the war despite being wounded twice in the Italian campaign, joined Winters in the quest for recognition. "My mother never sought the spotlight," he told a reporter from the Manchester Guardian in 1954. "But her story deserves to be told, if only so people understand that wars aren't won just by generals and soldiers. They're won by ordinary people doing extraordinary things, like a middle-aged seamstress who noticed a flaw in the parachute design and wouldn't rest until she'd fixed it." The campaign gathered momentum when several high-ranking officers from the airborne divisions, including Colonel James Norton of the 101st and Brigadier William Bates of the British 6th Airborne, added their voices to the cause. Both men had commanded units that used parachutes with the Wilson stitch and had seen firsthand the difference it made. "I lost 17 men in a training jump before we adopted Mrs. Wilson's modification," Bates stated in a formal letter to the War Office. "After implementation, we didn't lose a single man to parachute failure during combat jumps. The numbers speak for themselves." This woman's contribution to Allied victory was substantial and deserves official recognition. In 1956, a small ceremony was held at Wilkinson Mill, where a plaque was dedicated to Margaret's memory. The event was attended by local dignitaries, military representatives, and most poignantly, dozens of former paratroopers who owed their lives to her innovation. Many brought their families, children and wives who would not have existed had the Wilson stitch not saved their husbands and fathers from lethal equipment failure. Edward Wilson unveiled the plaque, which bore a simple inscription: "Margaret Wilson, 1901 to 1944. Her stitch saved 1,000 men. Her courage honors us all." Afterward, in a spontaneous gesture that brought tears to many eyes, each former paratrooper present placed a small pebble along the base of the plaque, an airborne tradition normally reserved for fallen comrades in arms. The ceremony at Wilkinson Mill was just the beginning. Pressure continued to mount for more significant recognition of Margaret's contribution and sacrifice. In 1959, her remains were identified through dental records and personal effects found near the improvised grave in Normandy. After extensive lobbying by veteran groups on both sides of the Atlantic, permission was granted for her to be reinterred at the Normandy American Cemetery with full military honors, despite her civilian status, a rare exception granted in recognition of her extraordinary contribution to the Allied victory. The Wilson stitch itself outlived its creator by many decades. Its principles were incorporated into parachute designs well into the jet age, and variations of Margaret's innovation can still be found in modern parachute systems and other high-stress textile applications. When NASA developed the parachute systems for the Apollo command modules returning from the moon, engineers incorporated elements of the Wilson stitch into their design. The Mars Pathfinder mission in 1997 used a derivative of her technique in the parachutes that slowed the spacecraft's descent to the Martian surface. Aviation historians estimate that her stitch ultimately saved between 800 and 1,200 lives during World War II alone, with countless more saved in the years since. The exact number will never be known, because Margaret's greatest success was in the failures that never happened, the tears that never spread, the men who landed safely without ever realizing how close they had come to disaster. Sergeant Daniel Abrams, a paratrooper with the 82nd Airborne who jumped into Sicily, Holland, and finally Germany, kept a piece of his D-Day parachute for the rest of his life. "Got a tear in it during the drop," he explained to his grandchildren decades later. "About 4 inches long, right along a seam. But it didn't spread. That lady's stitch held, and here I am, an old man with grandkids because of it." How do you thank someone for that? Technical manuals for paratrooper training now include a brief history of the stitch and its creator. Remember Margaret Wilson, instructors still tell nervous first-time jumpers? Her stitch will hold, even if your courage doesn't. At Fort Benning's U.S. Army Airborne School, a discreet plaque bears her name, alongside a quote from General Matthew Ridgway, commander of the 82nd Airborne. "For every paratrooper who landed safely in Europe, thank a skilled seamstress in England." The British Parachute Regiment incorporated a subtle visual reference to the Wilson stitch in their insignia, a detail so understated that only those who know the story would recognize it. When the regiment's headquarters at Browning Barracks was renovated in 2005, a small memorial garden was dedicated to the civilian workers of Britain's war industries, with Margaret Wilson's name given special prominence. Perhaps the most telling testament to Margaret's legacy came from an unexpected source. In 1972, a former German paratrooper commander named Kurt Müller visited the Normandy cemetery. Müller had led the Fallschirmjäger units tasked with developing countermeasures against Allied parachute improvements. After the war, he worked as an aerospace engineer before retiring to Switzerland. His visit to Normandy was a personal pilgrimage, a chance to pay respects to fallen comrades and former enemies alike. When he came upon Margaret Wilson's grave, Müller stood in silence for several minutes, then placed a small iron cross beside it, a gesture of profound respect from a former enemy. According to the cemetery groundskeeper who witnessed the moment, Müller wiped tears from his eyes before speaking. "We tried for 2 years to defeat this woman's stitch," he reportedly said to his companion. "We knew something had changed in 1943. Suddenly, Allied paratroopers were surviving drops that should have killed them. Our snipers would hit the canopy in the exact spots that used to cause catastrophic failure, but the chutes wouldn't collapse. We assigned a team of our best textile engineers to solve the mystery. They recovered dozens of parachutes from battlefields, studied every centimeter of stitching. We never succeeded. In the air, she beat us every time." Margaret Wilson never sought recognition for her work. She was a seamstress who saw a problem and fixed it, using the skills she had honed over decades of meticulous labor. She never wore a uniform or carried a weapon, but she saved more Allied lives than many decorated combat units. And when the moment of crisis came, she faced it with the same quiet courage that had characterized her entire life. For years after the war, paratroopers who served in Normandy would gather on the anniversary of D-Day to drink a toast to the angel with the magic stitch. Few knew her name, but all owed their lives to her innovation. In their stories, passed down through generations of airborne soldiers, Margaret became almost mythical, the civilian seamstress who jumped into combat with nothing but a needle and thread, saving others while unable to save herself. The truth, as is often the case, was both simpler and more profound. Margaret Wilson was not a mythical figure, but a real woman who did what needed to be done, regardless of personal cost. Her stitch was not magic, but the result of careful observation, technical skill, and stubborn determination. And her death was not predestined, but the cruel outcome of war's chaos and her own selfless choice. Today, a small display at the Airborne Museum in Sainte-Marie-Église, France, houses one of the few surviving parachutes made with Margaret's original stitch pattern. Beside it stands a simple sewing kit, similar to the one she carried on that fateful night. A small placard tells her story in just a few sentences, concluding with a quote attributed to Sergeant Miller, one of the last men to see her alive. "Some heroes carry rifles and lead charges. Margaret carried a needle and saved us all. The difference is, we came home to tell about it. She never did." In our modern age of computer-designed equipment and advanced materials, it's easy to forget how often in history lives have hung literally by a thread. Margaret Wilson's story reminds us that innovation often comes not from advanced laboratories or well-funded research programs, but from the keen eyes and skilled hands of those who see problems and refuse to accept that they cannot be solved. Somewhere in Normandy, perhaps in a field that has returned to peaceful cultivation, or beneath a town rebuilt after war's destruction, a parachute with a half-completed Wilson stitch lies buried with the woman who created it. It's a fitting memorial for Margaret, not a grand monument, but a quiet testament to work left unfinished, to a life given in service of others. If her story carries any lesson, perhaps it's this: heroism doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a middle-aged seamstress with a better idea and the courage to see it through, regardless of the cost. The next time you look up and see a parachute drifting gently through the sky, spare a thought for Margaret Wilson, the woman whose impossible stitch saved 1,000 men, but couldn't save her when she needed it most. If this story stayed with you, share your thoughts below. Every comment keeps history alive and honors those like Margaret who gave everything so others might land safely in a world free from tyranny.